Okay, so welcome to the Psychology of Action, today's workshop on overcoming procrastination. My name is Dan McCrae. I'm the Director of Academic Support at the Center for Distance Learning, and I'm joined by Amy Wozniak, and I'll let Amy introduce herself.
Sure. I'm Amy Wozniak, and I'm the Director of Academic Support out here in Buffalo, and I'll be moderating the chat box down in the corner, so if you have any questions or if you have any technical problems, feel free to ask me.
Okay, great. So, so today's workshop is on the psychology of action, on how to overcome procrastination. There is a lot of stuff, a lot of new research, a lot of information on why we procrastinate and how to overcome procrastination. And procrastination is one of those things where just kind of understanding why we procrastinate and being aware of that and kind of the mechanisms of how we procrastinate is really important. But there are also some really neat techniques that they've come up with over the last few years from research into procrastination that can be really helpful to students. So today we're gonna talk about why we procrastinate, and we're also going to talk about some ways, some really simple, concrete ways we can hopefully overcome procrastination. So just to kind of get started, just to give you an idea of why procrastination is a problem. Procrastination can become kind of a habit. When we start procrastinating, sometimes it can kind of develop into a habit, and it can be a real problem for people. Research shows that about 15 to 20% of people just kind of in the general population have this problem of kind of habitual procrastination, and that number jumps up to 80 to 85% of people who are in college. So it's a really intense and acute problem for people in college. And I think college is kind of one of those settings where there are just a lot more opportunities to procrastinate, and so I think it can become a real problem for people in college. And I think also, along with that goes, all the other outside factors like family, friends, jobs, those kinds of things that can kind of get in the way of our studies, and that can kind of give us reasons and help us kind of procrastinate more than we would otherwise. So the reason that can become such a problem is that the research also shows that people who procrastinate on a regular basis tend to have lower achievement levels than people who don't procrastinate. They have many more negative feelings like depression, anxiety, stress. They have more health problems. They get sick more often. They go to the doctor more often. They have more relationship problems and financial problems. So if it's something that develops into kind of a habitual thing for people, it can lead to lots of problems down the road. So it's really important to understand why we procrastinate and how to stop that process. So that's kind of why we're doing this workshop. So one of the things that I think is really helpful when it comes to procrastination is first kind of just defining procrastination and understanding what procrastination is and what procrastination isn't, when we're procrastinating and when we're not procrastinating. So Piers Steel is a researcher. He's a kind of a leading researcher into procrastination, and his definition of procrastination is that it's the voluntary postponement of an intended course of action despite having the opportunity to act and expecting to be worse off as a result of the delay. So in other words, we know what we have to do, we know there's a deadline, and we know if we don't do this activity or task, we're going to be worse off for it. But we do it anyways. We procrastinate anyways, even though we know those things. So that's what procrastination is. Peter Gollwitzer, who is probably the foremost researcher in the procrastination today, he's out of New York University. He kind of goes along with Piers Steel and talks about 4 criteria that have to be met in order to be procrastinating. So first, you have to be committed to a goal, some kind of task that you want to accomplish. You have to have an opportunity to act on the goal. You have to expect to be worse off later if you don't do the task, and you voluntarily decide to put off the action. So I think the key here is number 2, and that's having the opportunity to act. So a lot of times, kind of in our normal lives, we have lots of things that we really don't have a choice to procrastinate on. We might have families, we might have children that we have to, help with homework or cook dinner for. You know, we have stuff that we have to do for you know, important family members. And these things, sometimes when we're doing these things, they kind of make us feel like we're procrastinating, but we're actually not, because we don't have an opportunity to act in those situations. Like if we're doing something for our children, you know, that's not procrastination. That's taking care of an important commitment that we've made to our family. So that's important to know that, and it's important to kind of have that distinction so that we don't kind of beat ourselves up when we're, you know, taking care of you know, family life or work life, and not able to do something in school. That's actually not procrastination. That's taking care of some important things. So that's an important definition to kind of keep in mind, so that we know when we're procrastinating, we know when we're not procrastinating. So I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of get from you guys some reasons that you procrastinate. So what are some things that kind of cause you guys to procrastinate? Yeah, go ahead, Pollyanna.
Sometimes just not knowing how to get started, time management, how to juggle multiple courses, and breaking down the components of getting organized to complete those courses. So then you just get frustrated and you get overwhelmed and then you do nothing. Right.
So getting, you know, not knowing where to start, and then also just kind of being overwhelmed by the whole enormity of the task. Absolutely, that's good reasons. Yeah, go ahead, Sankofa.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on that. It's pretty much the same thing. I work very long hours. I work over 15 hours a day at home, and it's the same thing. It's like, you know, I kind of hear what you're saying with the family and work coming in, but then when it's that free time, it's like I feel like I have to choose between sleep and studying, and usually I choose sleeping.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Yeah, so you definitely understand the whole having the opportunity to act. Yeah, that's a big issue. And that whole getting started thing is a really a big thing for people, and you know, being overwhelmed by the enormity of a task, even if it's a task that we're looking forward to. If it's a huge project, you know, if it's a 20-page paper, that's going to be, you know, that's an overwhelming thing to think about sometimes. So yeah, and we're going to talk about both those things today, and some reasons, you know, why that leads to procrastination, and also some ways that we can kind of trick ourselves almost, some techniques that we can use. I use the term trick ourselves because I kind of do that to myself sometimes. I trick myself into doing things because I know that it'll lead to me getting things done. So we're going to talk about that today. So those are some good reasons. Thanks for sharing. So there's, you know, when I kind of was putting together this presentation, I just found so much research on procrastination. There's just article after article. There are experiments and you know, theoretical articles, all sorts of things that you could, you know, spend months and months and probably even years reading for why we procrastinate, reasons why we procrastinate, and people break it down into really, you know, small little details that you know, sometimes are helpful and sometimes aren't so helpful. But what I did was I kind of figured I would pick out five of the biggest reasons that we procrastinate and talk about those. And these kind of naturally lead into some techniques that we can use to try and get started on a task and start overcoming procrastination. And hopefully, you know, awareness of procrastination and why we procrastinate combined with the techniques that we're going to talk about today, I think will help you go a long way in overcoming those problems. Sankofa, did you have another question or comment?
No, sorry.
Okay. Oh, okay, that's okay. I just wanted to double check. All right, so there are basically 5 major reasons that we procrastinate. The first one is poor metacognition. And this has to do with the fact that, you know, sometimes the predictions and the perceptions and the judgments that we make about how long something's going to take, about how much work is going to be involved in a task, sometimes those aren't really accurate. And there's actually a lot of research that goes into this, and it shows that people really aren't really good judges of judging how much time a task is going to take. And so that's what metacognition is all about, is predicting things and kind of making judgments about how things are going to go in terms of getting a task done. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Poor prioritization kind of goes along with metacognition. Sometimes the way we prioritize things can kind of almost unconsciously lead us to procrastinate. And we're going to talk about how to do that in a more accurate way to make sure that we don't kind of just fall into procrastination inadvertently. So that's an important thing. The third thing is task aversion, and this is just a very simple thing. It's just sometimes some tasks are just very unpleasant, and we don't like to do them, and so we tend to put those things off. And so, this is an important thing to be aware of. And there's some really neat new research that they've done into how our brains work that show how this happens and how we can kind of overcome it. And this goes along with getting started on an activity or a task, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. The fourth thing is the fact that a lot of times people confuse their goals with their plans. And so having a goal is very different from having a plan. And this is basically most of the work that comes from Peter Gollwitzer. And his word for plan is an implementation intention. And what he's found is that people who don't make plans or don't have these implementation intentions, they are much more likely to procrastinate than people who do have plans. And these can be very simple plans. They're not complicated. They're not involved or in depth. They're very simple plans. But just by having that very simple plan, you're much less likely to procrastinate than if you didn't have a plan. So we're going to talk about that. That's probably one of the key techniques that we're going to talk about today that will help us overcome procrastination. And then the last thing I think that a lot of people have is just kind of a fear of failure, fearing that we're going to be judged by our professor or by our peers or by whoever it is that we're doing this task for. We might fail, make a mistake, and that can kind of lead to us not getting started because we don't want to fail. We don't want to go through that, and so it kind of leads just naturally into procrastination. So we're going to talk about all 5 of these things today and how we can overcome them. So the metacognitive errors that people have, there are basically 5 of them, and this comes out of the work of a guy named Joseph Ferrari, and he has done a lot of research into this, and has found that people who tend to procrastinate tend to have these 5 metacognitive errors. So the first error that they have is they tend to underestimate how long a task will take. So if we have a paper that's due in 2 months, and it's 2 months away, we might think to ourselves, well, this paper might take maybe a week or 2. That is usually not an accurate estimate of how long that paper is going to take. And so a lot of times procrastinators just don't do a good job of understanding how much work is really going to be involved in completing a task. And this might be at school, it might be at work, it might be something around the house. But people who procrastinate generally underestimate how long that's going to take to get accomplished. So that's important to know. The second thing is they overestimate how much time that they have left to complete a task. So, let's say we have a paper that's due in 2 weeks. We might think to ourselves, oh, that's a lot of time. I don't have to worry about that at all. I have plenty of time to do that paper. Where actually 2 weeks might not be enough time at all to get that paper done. We might have to, really start working right away to get it done in time. And so when we overestimate how much time we have left to complete a task, we tend not to get started, and that leads to procrastination. So a third error that people make when they procrastinate is they tend to think that they're going to be more motivated in the future. And so this is almost, I think, probably a universal error that people make. I don't feel like doing it today. I'll feel more like doing it tomorrow, so I'm going to put it off until tomorrow. So that's just believing that I'll be more motivated in the future. And the problem with that is that we're almost never more motivated in the future. Tomorrow comes around and we think to ourselves, I'm really not feeling like I want to do this today, so I'm going to put it off again until tomorrow. I'll feel more like doing it tomorrow. And so that's a kind of a constant error that people make. And it's an ongoing thing, and it turns out that almost it never happens that in the future we're more motivated. So that's a common one. So the fourth error is that people who procrastinate they think that they have to feel like it in order to succeed at a task. So if they're not feeling emotionally kind of fired up about something, and they start working on a task, they believe that they won't be successful. So they tend to, like, say to themselves, well, I just don't feel like it right now. If I worked on it right now, it probably wouldn't be any good anyway, so I'm going to put it off until I feel like it. So that's another error that people make that can lead to procrastination. And then the final one is kind of related to that fourth one, but it's the idea that if I don't feel like it, I'm going to fail. I'm not going to do well at it if I don't feel like I'm in the mood to do that. So it has to do with emotions, and it has to do with believing that our emotions are tied to the quality of our work. So that's important stuff. It's an important kind of perception to check and to understand that that's not true, actually. That even if we don't feel like doing something, if we do the work, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be just as good, if not better. If we have more time to work on it and kind of polish it more, we might actually produce a better result, even if we don't feel like it, even if emotionally we don't feel like doing it. So this work, like I said, it comes from the work of Joseph Ferrari, and this other guy, Phil, I think his name is Phil Morano. He did kind of a write-up of Joseph Ferrari's work in Psychology Today, and all these articles that I talk about today, they're included in the bibliography. So if you want to do some further reading and look into this stuff on your own, you can check out the bibliography at the end of the presentation. So any questions about the metacognitive errors? Any comments or questions? Do you guys kind of see those things happening for yourselves?
Absolutely. Every one of them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. Like it's almost a universal, it's like a universal human thing, I think, for us to have these thoughts. So, okay, good. Okay, so those are the metacognitive errors, and like I said, just being aware of these errors are really important, and knowing that a lot of times our judgments and our perceptions aren't accurate, and that we might have to, maybe double the amount of time that we estimate a task is going to take. That's a really good idea to do. Sometimes even tripling the amount of time that a task is going to take, is important. And also, being really kind of keyed into the fact that our motivation will probably not improve with time. We're probably not going to feel more like doing it in the future, that we just have to get started, and our motivation will come after we get started. So those are important things. So related to the metacognitive errors is how we prioritize things. And so this comes out of the work of a guy named Stephen Covey, who is kind of a famous productivity, management kind of guru. And I really like this system that he uses because it really kind of helps us key in on those things where we tend to procrastinate. So what we have here is kind of a grid, and it's a quadrant. There are 4 quadrants. So we have the urgency axis, which is like the left and the right axis. So things on the right are less urgent, things on the left are more urgent. And then we have the importance axis, which is the vertical axis, the up and down axis. And so things towards the top of that axis are more important, and things towards the bottom of that axis are less important. So that gives us 4 quadrants. So the first quadrant are things that are urgent and important. So these are like things that we have to do, and they're important to us, and we have to get them done pretty quickly. So for instance, if we have a quiz in a class, and the class is tomorrow, and we know that that's coming up tomorrow, that's a quadrant 1 thing. We have to, it's important to us, we want to do well on it for our class, and it's urgent. It's going to be tomorrow. We have to prepare for it. So that's a quadrant 1 task. Quadrant 2 are things that are important, but they're not urgent. So let's say we have a paper at the end of the semester. It's the beginning of the semester, September 14th. The paper's not due until December 15th. So that paper is 3-4 months away. It's important. It may be 75% of our grade in this class, but it's not urgent. It's off in the future, and it's not something that we have to get done right now. So it's important, but it's not urgent. Covey calls these things, Stephen Covey calls these things, they're quality times. They're things that they're important to us, but it's not something that is going to affect us if we don't do it today. It's going to affect us in the long term. Hi, Rosie. Welcome to the workshop. so quadrant 3 are things that are that's okay, Rosie. We're gonna help you with that. So so quadrant 3 are things that are urgent, but they're not important. So these are kind of things that are distractions. So things like, going, let's say going on Facebook, that's something, and maybe checking in with our friends. Like that might be something that we want to do. It's urgent that we do that. We stay up to date with our friends, but it's not really all that important. We don't really, it's not really going to affect us if we don't do that in a real negative way. So they seem urgent to us, but they're not really that important. Quadrant 4 are things that are neither urgent nor important. So Covey calls these things time wasters. And these are things like, watching TV, watching kind of like a mindless sitcom, or watching, playing a video game, let's say. So they're neither urgent nor important. If we don't do them, it's not really going to bother us. It's not going to hurt us one way or the other. And it's not really urgent either. No one's telling us we have to do this. We just kind of want to unwind and we want to relax maybe. And so we do them. And sometimes, and those things are important, having recreation, even, quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 are both kind of like rest and relaxation things. And so those things are important, but it's also important that we understand, that some of these things that we might think are really, really important to us, like checking in on Facebook or watching a TV show, they're in the big scheme of things, they're not really going to help us achieve our goals. So it's important that we plan to get our the urgent and important things, and maybe even not the urgent things, but the important things done, so that we can plan the quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 things into our schedules, and we have time to rest and relax. So let me just ask, you guys hearing what I've talked about so far about these quadrants, which quadrant do you think we tend to procrastinate the most in? What one of those quadrants are the things that we tend to procrastinate on?
Quadrant 1 and 2.
Quadrant 1 and 2. Okay. What about Rosie and Sankofa? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Where we procrastinate the most?
I would, for me, I would say number 2, quality time. Because
number 2.
If something is urgent, if it's a quiz, I'm going to prepare for it. But something like a paper, instead of putting the material together ahead of time, I'm going to wait till the final weeks and suffer.
Exactly. Yep.
So,
no,
yeah.
That's right. Yeah, you guys you're actually kind of both right. So quadrant 2 is definitely the one that we procrastinate the most on. But what we do a lot of times is we use the other quadrants 1, 3, and 4. We use those kind of to procrastinate. So quadrant 2, those are the things that we tend to procrastinate on, and sometimes, a lot of times actually, it's almost unconscious procrastination because it's kind of far off in the future. So we just think to ourselves, I don't really have to worry about that. I can put that off, and it's not going to hurt me. So quadrant 2, that is like kind of the big one we have to watch out for. Those are the types of projects and tasks that we're going to tend to procrastinate on. So when we prioritize our to-do list or prioritize the things that we have to do, it's really useful to say, well, what are my quadrant 2 things? What are the things that are important to me, but they're not that urgent? Because those are the things that I have to plan to work on ahead of time, so that I don't have to, do a 20-page paper in 2 nights or 1 night. So those are the things we have to watch out for. So that's why the quadrant 2 thing is really important. So good stuff. I'm glad. Thanks for sharing, both of you guys. And Rosie, I saw what you wrote down there too, Rosie. You're right. I think quadrant 1 and 2, they kind of go together. Quadrant 2 is, like I said, that's the big thing, but we use the other quadrants to kind of get in the way of the quadrant 2 things. Okay, so this next stuff we're going to talk about is called task aversion, and there's some really, really interesting and kind of exciting new research that has gone into why people procrastinate and how those things can kind of get in the way, how our own kind of physiology and how our brains can kind of get in the way of us getting things done. So this work is done, So this work was done, and it was a really interesting research article where they had people who were, in this case it was a math problem, and they had to do a math problem, and it was a really kind of an unpleasant thing for these people to do this problem, and they had them hooked up to brain scanners while they did the problem. And what they found is that just even before they did the task, just by thinking about doing that math problem, the pain centers of their brains would light up. And so what they actually found is that our brain doesn't really distinguish between emotional, psychological pain and physical pain. So the same part of our brain that lights up when we stub our toe is the same part of our brain that lights up when we think about doing an unpleasant task. So they found that just by thinking about that problem, it was no different than stubbing your toe or running into a wall or whatever. It was the same. Your brain did not distinguish between the two things, so it caused pain. And the really interesting thing they found is that once the people started doing the math problem, the pain centers actually they went away. They kind of deactivated. So just by doing the task, that pain, that sensation of pain went away. So that was a really important finding. And that kind of got me thinking about, how, in my own life, in my own, struggles with procrastination, how I've kind of encountered this problem. And so back, the job I had before this job, I was the director of something called the TRIO program. And this was a federal grant. It was a program for college students, and it helped students with tutoring and workshops and a whole bunch of other services. And we basically every year had to do a report for the federal government where we had to report on about 350 students that we served, and each one of those 350 students had about 37 data fields that we had to report on to the federal government. So this was a huge task. It was very unpleasant and took a long time. And so the first year that I actually became the director and I learned that I had to do this report, it was just after I'd read the stuff on the metacognitive errors that we talked about. So that actually helped me. I realized, oh, okay, so I think this report will probably take about a month, but that's probably not accurate. I'm probably underestimating how much time that's going to take. So I actually doubled it. I said, well, I'm going to give myself 2 months to do this report. And it was a good thing I did that because it did take longer than a month. But because I had enough time, I was actually able to get the report done. It was about a week early that first time I did it. So I was pretty happy about that. And then the next year, it's the same thing. I was able to get it done. I started 2 months early. I got it done in time. I had plenty of time to do it, and I got it done. So the third year, the thing that happened was this was such a big task, and it was so unpleasant for me. I really hated doing it. It was very tedious. It took all my time. It was just a very draining task to do for me. And because it was so unpleasant, I think, those pain centers of my brain actually, were lighting up. And so when the brain experiences pain, it's hardwired to want to get rid of that pain. Like the first thing that we do when we're in pain is we want the pain to stop. So the way that we stop the pain is we don't think about the task and we don't do the task. And so that's what I did with this report. I would just, kind of put it off, and it got to the point, 2 or 3 days into, putting this task off, every day I would think to myself, okay, I got to start this report today. And it almost seemed like there was this physical force that was stopping me from doing the report. And at first I was kind of mystified, and it this went on for probably maybe a week or two. And finally I just forced myself to do it, and I pushed through it, and I started the task. And after a couple of days of working on it, I actually started getting into it, and I think that those pain centers kind of went away, and I started working on it. But when I read this research, I thought to myself, well, that must have been what happened. I must have, those pain centers of my brain must have lit up when I was thinking about doing this report, and it didn't actually stop. The pain centers didn't actually go away until I started doing the report and actually got into the task. So that's a really important thing to do, and that kind of highlights sometimes how hard procrastination is to overcome, because it's almost like we're hardwired. Our brains are hardwired to procrastinate in some ways, because we don't want to experience pain. You know, we want to do anything we can to stop the pain. And, you know, if we put off the report and we feel better, then, you know what, we're probably going to continue to do that. So that's an important thing to know. The other important thing to know, though, is that once you start the task, that pain also goes away. So it's almost like you have to kind of break through that wall and just get into the task and do it. And once you start it, that sensation kind of goes away, and it gets much easier to work on it. So that's a really kind of exciting and new finding that they've found that I think can be really helpful. And so this is the work of Timothy Pychyll, who has written a great book on procrastination. It's called How to Solve the Procrastination Puzzle. And he actually talks a lot about Peter Gollwitzer and his work and some of the other researchers. But he's actually a psychologist at, I think, the University of Calgary in Canada. Or it might be Ottawa, I don't remember. But one of those, it's a university in Canada. He teaches psychology up there and has written a great book. And he kind of did some work that kind of validated that stuff that we just talked about with the brain. So he did this experiment with a couple of psychology classes that he was teaching. So what he would do every week for his class, they would have a paper due Friday night. And they knew that the paper was coming. Every Friday, this was an ongoing thing. And they had pagers. His students had pagers that they carried with them throughout the week. And throughout the week, they would just page the students and ask them questions like, you know, how do you perceive that paper? What do you think about that paper right now? And what they found is on Mondays, the students perceived that paper as being very stressful, very unpleasant, and very difficult. But then as the week went on and they continued to page them, by Thursday when they paged them and they were actually doing the paper, they found that they perceived the paper to be much less stressful, much less unpleasant, and much less difficult. They actually, and some students actually reported enjoying doing the paper. So what that kind of validates is that whole idea that when something is unpleasant, you know, we perceive it in a very negative way. But when we actually start the task, that perception of difficulty and stress and unpleasantness kind of goes away. So one of the key things that we kind of have learned from the research is that when you, just by starting a task, so, you know, there's a couple ways that we can look at this, and so there's some kind of ways that we can trick ourselves into starting a task. So one of the things that I do a lot to kind of trick myself into getting into a task is, let's say I'm working on a paper or an article that I'm writing, and I don't really want to do it. So I think to myself, well, you know what, I'll just kind of proofread it. I won't do any writing, but I'll just proofread the article and see if I can find any errors. And once I start reading it and proofreading it, and looking for spelling errors and those kinds of things, I actually start getting into the paper, and I actually do start writing. You know, so it's kind of a way that I've learned that I can kind of trick myself into starting a task. Another way is by, you know, just telling yourself, well, I can just do the title page. Maybe I can just do the title page for the paper and at least get that done, you know. And, you know, you write your name and the title and your date and the date and the class and all that kind of stuff. And then once you start doing that stuff, you find, oh, you know, maybe I'll just work on the introduction a little bit. And so it's just a lot easier to get into writing the paper when we just get started. Another trick is to just do the bibliography or the works cited page, you know, as a way to kind of get into the task and kind of break through that pain sensation that we feel. So those are some ways that we can kind of use, you know, the awareness of our physiology and how our brain works, and also kind of find some techniques to kind of get around that. Any questions about that stuff? Are you guys with me?
Yes, I'm here, Daniel. Unfortunately, I got a call, so I didn't hear what you said. So I'll just replay the workshop.
We'll send out the recording to you when we're done, so you won't miss anything.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So so now we're going to get into implementation intentions, and so this is the work of Peter Gollwitzer. And so what he found is that basically kind of the power, the kind of unexpected power of having simple plans, how that can help us. And so kind of the way I think about this, one of the kind of metaphors that kind of helped me think about this, or maybe not metaphor, but kind of example, I guess, that helped me think about this, is when you think about people wanting to go to the moon. So humanity has wanted to go to the moon probably for thousands of years, probably as long as we've been around. People have wanted to go there and see what it's like. And even when we kind of developed the technology to know what it was involved in going to the moon, probably then it was years and years people really wanted to go to the moon. It was an important goal to us, but it wasn't really until President Kennedy, in 1961 or 62, I think it was, said, you know what, we're going to go to the moon. We're going to create a space agency, and they're going to create this technology, and we're going to have our scientists work on it, and within 8 years, we're going to get to the moon. And so that's what it took, finally, for us to get to the moon. We actually had to have a plan and put that plan into action for us to achieve that goal. So having the goal, even though we really, really wanted to achieve that goal, it wasn't enough. We actually had to develop a plan and put that plan into place for us to achieve that goal. And so that's kind of what Peter Gollwitzer found, that a lot of times we have these, it's almost like New Year's resolutions, right? New Year's resolutions are goals, and we really want to achieve these goals, but most people don't accomplish their New Year's resolutions. And what Peter Gollwitzer found is that the reason they don't accomplish them is because they don't have a plan. And just by having a very simple plan, you're like 2 or 3 times more likely to achieve a goal than if you don't have a plan. And Timothy Pychyll and Peter Gollwitzer both found that even if you're really motivated and you really, really want to get an A in this course and you're really motivated to do well in it, if you don't have a plan and then another person comes along and they're not motivated, they don't really care if they get a good grade in this course, but they do have a plan of how they're going to get through the course. The person with the plan is much more likely to achieve that goal of getting through the course and getting a good grade than even the person who's really motivated but doesn't have a plan. So plans trump goals every time is what Peter Gollwitzer found. So that's why this stuff can really help us. So an implementation intention is just it's a simple, concrete plan that supports a goal intention by setting out in advance when, where, and how we're going to achieve this goal. So a lot of times you can phrase them and kind of come up with different plans, but one of the plans that Peter Gollwitzer found was if we make them conditional, so an if-then plan. So if X happens, then I'm going to do Y, and the Y is the concrete plan. So if I say to myself, you know what, I'll feel more like doing this tomorrow, that's going to be a trigger, and we're going to think to ourselves, wait a minute, that's not accurate. That's one of those metacognitive errors. Whenever I have that metacognitive error, I'm actually going to start working on that project. So that's an if-then kind of example. Another example of an if-then implementation intention is when the kids are in bed, I'll turn off my phone, go to my desk, and work on my project. So when you do that, when you have that if-then implementation intention, what it does is it takes conscious control of an action away from our conscious selves and kind of puts it on the environment. So this leads to what Peter Gollwitzer called automaticity, where action is quick, efficient, and we don't have to think about it. We don't have to consciously think about it. It's like a trigger in the environment, and when we see that trigger, we just do the action. We do the plan. And so that's one example of how an implementation can work. There are other ones as well, and they just involve well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but basically they involve what, where, and when we're going to do a goal. How, what, where, and when, and we'll talk more about that. But first, I wanted to talk real quick about 2 of the studies that kind of led Peter Gollwitzer to discover this fact about implementation intentions, and then we'll talk about some other plans, examples of implementation intentions. So the first study that Peter Gollwitzer did, in both these studies, there were roughly 100 people in each one of these studies, and these were students that were in his class. He was also a psychology professor, and I think he's at New York University. So the first study he did, he had an unpleasant task. It was a paper that he assigned the students to write, and it was, I think, an 8 or 10 page paper. And so all the students in this class were randomly assigned either someone was going to help them come up with an implementation intention, a plan to get the paper done, and the other group, they were just kind of left on their own. So they were just assigned the paper, and it was up to them how they were going to get it done. So no one helped them come up with a plan. And so at the end of the experiment, they looked at how many people completed the paper, and they found that the students who were given help with coming up with a plan, 62% of those students completed the paper. But only 22% of the people who didn't come up with a plan completed the paper. So by having that simple plan, and it wasn't a complicated plan, it was just like, you know, this weekend I'm going to, you know, work on this paper all weekend long, and I'm going to hand it in on Monday. That might have been just as simple as the plan was. But just having that simple plan increased your odds of getting that paper done, you know, it more than doubled it. It almost tripled to how much more likely you were to get that paper done. The second paper, this was another really interesting study he did. And so this paper, this research study he did in his class, and it was the week before Christmas break. So the Friday before Christmas break, so this is kind of a cruel experiment. So the Friday before Christmas break, he just kind of sprung this assignment on his students. And the assignment was they had to write an 8-page paper over Christmas break, and they had to turn it in when they got back. And so half the group were given help with coming up with a plan with an implementation intention. And when they talked to those students, they also said, you know what, we don't care about, you know, when you turn this paper in, but we want to know, you know, what is your own personal deadline? Like, when do you want to have this paper done by? And so they would just get information on when that group, when that student chose to get that paper done. So it could be any time over Christmas break. It was like a self-imposed deadline. The other group, they didn't have any help with coming up with a plan, and they also, you know, they didn't have a deadline. They just had to get it. They didn't have a self-imposed deadline. They just had to get it turned in after Christmas break. So at the end of the experiment, they looked at, you know, how many people completed it. 71% of the people who had the plans got the paper finished, and out of that 71%, 83% of that group met their own self-imposed deadline. So let's say, you know, a student said, I'm going to get this paper done by December 27th. 83% of those people got it done by that date, you know, if they had an implementation intention. The group that had no implementation intentions, only 32% of them got the paper done. So these are, you know, really powerful effects. You know, you can more than double, you know, your chances of getting something done just by having a simple plan. And so there's been some new research that Peter Gollwitzer has done that I actually didn't have a chance to include in today's presentation, but it's something called a meta-analysis, and that's where they look at a whole bunch of studies. And there's actually been 94 different studies that have been done that looked at implementation intentions. And they found that in 94 and 65% of the cases was people who had implementation intentions. So it kind of goes along with the statistics here. 65% better chance of getting something done if you had a simple plan in over 94 different studies. So this is something that is a consistent finding. It shows up in, you know, experiment after experiment. Just by having a simple plan, you can really improve your chances of getting something done and cutting down on procrastination. So that's some really important stuff. So one of the other things that Peter Gollwitzer found is that it's important when you have these implementation intentions, when you have these plans, that you also plan for overcoming temptations. So for example, if you have a plan of working on a paper, you know, when you think to yourself, okay, tonight at 10 o'clock I'm going to start my paper. Also, you should kind of include in that plan, like turning off your phone, turning off your email or your Facebook, and turning off the TV, just kind of planning for reducing distractions and reducing things that will kind of take you away from your tasks that you want to get accomplished. So, you know, turning off the TV, getting started, you know, that's another really good example of a plan. You know, even if I don't work on my paper tonight, at least I'm going to get my title page done. You know, that's a good implementation intention. Also, another thing is to kind of make a list of temptations and distractions, and so this will be different for everybody. You know, I love to read the news on the internet. You know, I'm definitely a news junkie. So for me, you know, I would tell myself, okay, I'm not going to turn on Yahoo News, or I'm not going to turn on Reddit. I'm just going to go to my computer, turn on Word, and start working on my paper. So that's a simple implementation intention that includes, dealing with temptations and distractions for me. So it's going to be different for everybody, but it's something that you can, put into practice right away that will help you overcome this procrastination. So this is an example. Instead of using an if-then statement, this is another kind of implementation intention. This is just where you answer basically 5 questions. The first question is, what is it? What do you want to accomplish? When are you going to follow through? When are you going to work on it? Where are you going to do it? And how will you do it? So those are kind of like the 4 key things. And then the 5th question is, and this is something that people have found, the researchers have found, that people who procrastinate really don't do this at all. They don't think about consequences. They don't think about, what is it going to look like if I work on this paper tonight for a couple hours, and what is it going to look like if I don't work on this paper tonight for a couple hours? How am I going to feel tomorrow? And so try to think about those consequences in vivid detail. How am I going to feel if I do it? How am I going to feel if I don't do it? And then, put that plan into action. So doing those 5 things is just another example of an implementation intention, very simple plan that we can put into place to get things done. So this is just a kind of an example I came up with for myself. So the example is, working on a psychology paper. When will I follow through? Tonight after I put the kids to bed, I'll turn off the TV, work on my paper for at least an hour. So that's the implementation intention right there. And you can include the if-then statement in that second part. So that's something people can do as well if you want to. The third thing, where will I do it? I'm going to work on my computer desk in the living room. How will I do it? I'm going to make sure that my phone's off, everyone in the house knows that I'm busy, and I'm going to set a timer for at least 30 minutes. I'm going to write for 30 minutes, I'll take a 10-minute break, and then reset the timer and work for another 30 minutes. So that's kind of, that might be a little bit too detailed for some people, but for me, that works. And so these are the kind of things that you're going to have to kind of tweak for yourself, and maybe you might want to be more detailed, maybe you might want to be less detailed, but for me, this is something that worked. And then that next step, that 5th step, is thinking about the consequences. What is it going to look like when I complete this paper or work on this paper for 2 hours? What is it going to look like if I don't work on it for 2 hours? What are the long-term consequences? Try to think about those in some vivid detail, and then put that plan into action. So working in 30-minute to 50-minute chunks is also a really important technique. It helps us overcome procrastination in a couple ways. One of the ways is that it kind of helps us break down really big, overwhelming projects. If we're thinking about working on something for 8 hours, that's a really big, overwhelming idea that we have. But if we're able to say, I'm just going to work on it for half an hour tonight. That's it. That's much less overwhelming, and it helps us kind of break down and chunk out the task that we're working on. So that helps us get started, helps us get over that being overwhelmed kind of feeling. Another really important thing is that it helps our brains process information more efficiently and effectively. Our brains are really good at processing the beginning and the end of things, but we're not so good at processing stuff in the middle. So when we have like one marathon study session or writing session where we write for let's say 8 hours, we might remember the first half an hour of that really well and the last half an hour of that process really well, but that big chunk in the middle, that 7 hours in the middle, we might not really remember that very well, and might not have a good grasp of that material. So when we kind of chunk it out and break it up into smaller sessions, we process the information much better, and we're able to retain and understand that information better as well. So this is just kind of an example of what that looks like and why our brains are just better at dealing with shorter chunks. And so that first example there, that's like an 8-hour marathon study session or writing session. And so, the part at the very beginning and the very end, those are the parts that we're going to remember the most and that our brains are going to process the most effectively. If we break it up into 2 4-hour chunks, that's better than 8 hours. We have those, instead of just 2 areas that we remember well and have processed well, we have 4. But if we break it up into 1-hour study sessions and we take 10-minute breaks in between those study sessions, we're going to remember and process a lot more information, and it's going to help us understand the material, and put it into practice a lot better, a lot more effectively. So does that make sense to people?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Okay, so what I want you to do is think about, what are some simple concrete plans that you can come up with? What are some ways that we can kind of include what we've learned about today into some actual things that we do in school? And so one of the things I really like to do, and one of the things I just kind of have developed into a habit, is to come up with to-do lists. And so one way that we can kind of incorporate what we've talked about today into our academic college lives is to include the stuff about the prioritization and the implementation intentions into our to-do list. So it might take us a little bit longer to do the to-do list, and it might be a little bit more involved and detailed, but we'll be much more likely to accomplish the goals and the tasks that we set for ourselves if we set up our to-do list like this. So the first thing is, we have a list of things that we want to do. We've prioritized them using those 4 quadrants that we talked about. So the psych paper that's due, let's say it's due at midterm of the semester, that's a quadrant 2 thing. It's important, but it's not urgent. So that's something that we should highlight and kind of put a red flag next to and make sure that we work on this quadrant 2 thing. And then we have the 3 things that we want to include in the implementation intention. When are we going to do it, where are we going to do it, and how are we going to do it? So that's just kind of a simple way that we can incorporate what we've talked about today into getting things done in college. So that's just something that I think is a kind of simple way to do that. And one thing that's important to do is to not overthink the implementation intentions. We don't have to come up with complicated plans. Just a very simple plan, it will increase our odds of getting that task done. So just very simple, even 1 or 2 word answers, when, where, how, those just by doing that, we'll be much more likely to get that thing done. And then, so the final thing we're going to talk about today is kind of fear of failure. So this is kind of one of the final causes of procrastination. And so one of the things that's important to remember is that a lot of times fear of failure comes around when we think about, we want to write the perfect paper or we want to do the perfect project. And when we say that to ourselves, when we say, I have to write the perfect paper, that's something that's almost unachievable. People, even if they work really, really hard and really, really long, there are always going to be little mistakes, little typos. I've written a couple grants, big, long grants that involved asking for lots of money from the federal government. And mistakes in these grants could lead to some pretty drastic consequences. We could lose a lot of money if we don't get these grants. And what I've found is, after reading lots of different grants, not only from me but from other people, is that I've never seen a perfect grant. There's almost always mistakes, whether it might be grammatical or a period or a comma or a misspelled word. When you write big long papers, there are going to be things that you miss. Even if you work really hard and even if you get most of the mistakes, writing the perfect paper is something that we almost never do. It might be achievable, but if we let that fear of being perfect stop us from doing it, then it kind of snowballs and leads to a much worse outcome than if we just say, okay, even if I write an imperfect paper, I'm just going to get it done. I just need to get this done. That's a much better goal than having that goal of writing the perfect paper. So giving ourselves kind of permission to make mistakes and understanding that there is no such thing as perfection, that there's always going to be imperfections. I've read books by really world famous writers and found mistakes in the novels. So it's something that happens, something we just have to learn to kind of deal with. And this also is something that Peter Gollwitzer found with people who do when they use those implementation intentions that we've talked about. Even then, people still procrastinate. They just procrastinate much less. So if you have an implementation intention, you might procrastinate for an hour and a half on average, but if you don't have an implementation intention at all, you'll procrastinate much longer. So even when you do the things that we're talking about today, it's not going to be perfect. You're still going to procrastinate a little bit. You'll just hopefully procrastinate much less than if you didn't have that implementation intention. So we're getting close to the end here. So these are just some of the tips that we talked about today. Kind of going back to all the different 5 reasons why we procrastinate. So the first thing is, am I making accurate predictions? Those metacognitive errors, thinking about those, being aware that we make those metacognitive errors kind of all the time, and just trying to kind of control for that. And one rule of thumb is to kind of double the amount of time that we work on a task. That's going to probably be much more accurate than our first judgment of how long we think it's going to take to do that task. Am I working on the important but not urgent things? Am I working on those quadrant 2 things? Just getting started, and even if it's really unpleasant and we really don't want to do it, just get started, and that will snowball into some positive action that will get things done. Having the implementation intentions, planning for temptations and distractions. Another really important thing that Peter Gollwitzer found is that people who are optimistic and flexible, so they had the implementation intentions, but they were also optimistic about their abilities, and they're also flexible, so they could kind of change their plans as they went along. Those people were much more likely to use those implementation intentions and get the task done than people who were pessimistic and had implementation intentions. So getting tongue-tied, it's near the end here. So I just thought if anyone wanted to talk about their tips, things that they've used in the past to help overcome procrastination, I think that's always kind of an interesting thing to hear from people.
Well, I will jump in and say I was talking to Dan before this workshop because even though I have a PhD, I am a chronic procrastinator, and unfortunately, while that worked for me in college, it didn't work for me in graduate school because when you're writing a 250-page dissertation, you can't put that off until the night before. So for me, what worked was just to do small chunks. So I'd force myself to write, so many words a day, even if it was just 2 pages a day, or to read 50 pages a day or something like that. Breaking it down into small, manageable chunks was the best thing that worked for me, and then I felt like I had a sense of progress. And also I noticed that my classmates were jealous because I'd say, oh, I wrote 2 pages every day this week, and they'd be like, oh, so unfair, I can't do that. So it gave me a sense of achievement that kept me pushing forward.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, definitely. Breaking things into chunks is definitely a good idea. Anyone else? Pollyanna or Sankofa, do you have any tips that you've used in the past?
Well, this is my first semester.
Oh.
Go ahead, Sephora.
Okay, yeah. This is not my first semester. It's my first semester back from like about 7 years out of school. And honestly, I'm a chronic, really bad procrastinator. So usually my success would just be getting it all done initially or getting it all done last minute, and that hasn't helped. So I learned a lot of new things here, especially with the fact that your brain kind of prompts you to delay. So when I do start procrastinating, I'm just gonna have to really fight that feeling.
Right.
Now that I'm more aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the important thing there is to actually just get started, and that's the hardest part. And if you just get started, then that feeling goes away. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Good. What about you, Pollyanna?
Well, this is my first semester back after 20-something years of not being in school, and so it has been an incredible challenge. But I do have to say that when I forced myself, to sit down and do it, it did start to flow a lot better, and I was getting stuff done. Unfortunately, I started railed because then I got a sinus and ear infection, so now getting back into it has been a challenge. So, again, just trying to power through it and, sitting here with the book open. Yes, sometimes I'm sitting and it's like okay, nothing is, sinking in, but, just still trying to get through it, trying to change it up, like go to the questions and try to look for the answers in the book instead of just like sitting down and reading the entire chapter. This way you're still getting the information. So,
right.
I've been doing a lot of workshops, the online ones, and, going to the campus and doing those as well. So, all of it has been very, helpful, so.
Great. Great, good. Well, that's good to hear. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, I think those are good good techniques. Just basically forcing yourself to get started and sitting there at the open book. I think is a good one because then that kind of helps break through that whole brain thing, the pain thing that we talked about. So really good. Great. So we'll send out a recording of today's workshop if you missed anything. And if you have any questions, you can we have time now, and if you think of something later, you can feel free to email me or Amy, and we could, we'd love to talk more about it and help you out if you have any problems.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
All right, you're welcome. Thanks for coming, guys.
All right, have a good day.
You too. Thanks, Amy, for helping out.
Have a great day, everyone. I think you got that link for the evaluation, so if you could fill that out, that would be really helpful. It helps us to plan our upcoming workshops. Thanks a lot.
Great. Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.